The high plains of the Dakota Territory hold their secrets close, burying them under dust and blood. This isn't a story of heroes in white hats or damsels waiting for rescue. This is the story of Clara May Thompson, a widow with healing hands, forced by a corrupt sheriff to save the life of a man her town considered a devil. He was a wounded Lakota warrior, a prisoner destined for a rope. But in the silence of her isolated cabin, a different story was written, one of whispered words, shared pain, and a dangerous alliance. What happened in that cabin didn't just save a man's life. It gave birth to a legend who would one day return to claim everything, starting with her. The dust of redemption. Gulch settled on everything, a fine red powder that coated window sills, soured the water in the barrel, and clung to the black mourning dress Clara May Thompson had worn for 2 years. It was a town that lived up to half its name. There was a gulch, but redemption was in short supply. For Clara, it was a purgatory. Since her husband John had been taken by fever, she existed on the town's periphery, the quiet widow in the cabin at the edge of the creek, known for her knowledge of herbs and little else. She was useful, but not welcome. The day her life shattered began not with a gunshot, but with the heavy rhythmic thud of horses approaching at a walk too deliberate for a simple traveler. Clara was grinding horehound, the sharp medicinal scent filling her small, clean cabin when the shadows fell across her doorway. Sheriff Elias Thorne stood there, filling the frame. He was a man carved from granite and greed. His face a roadmap of hard living, his silver star, the only thing about him that shined. Behind him, 2 deputies, Miller and Cobb, flanked a horse. Slumped over its saddle, tied by his wrists, was a man. A Lakota man. His body was a canvas of violence. A blood-soaked bandage was crudely tied around his thigh, and another stained the buckskin across his shoulder. His long black hair was matted with sweat and dirt. Even unconscious, he possessed a raw, intimidating presence that made the air in Clara's quiet world crackle. Thompson Thorne's voice was gravel. "Get your things. You've got a patient." Clara's hands stilled over the mortar. "Sheriff, I tend to fevers and set simple bones. That man needs a doctor." "Dr. Abernathy is 2 days' ride away in Fort Laramie," Thorne said, stepping inside. His presence seemed to suck the air from the room. "And I don't have 2 days. I need this one alive." "What for?" The question was out before she could stop it. It was a foolish thing to ask a man like Thorne. His eyes, small and dark, narrowed. "He's my key. His name is Kangi, leader of a war party that hit the Blackwood stage. We caught him, but the rest scattered. He knows where they are, and he knows where they're meeting. He's going to tell me." Thorne's smile was a slash in his beard. "But he's no good to me dead." The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Thorne didn't want him healed. He wanted him just alive enough to be broken. "I won't," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. She looked at the figure on the horse, a man reduced to a piece of meat, a key. Thorne took another step, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. "You misunderstand, Mrs. Thompson. This ain't a request. You're a woman alone out here. Town tolerates you because you're John's widow. But tolerance is a thin rope. You'll keep him alive in your cabin until he's strong enough for me to have a conversation with him. Cobb and Miller will stand guard outside. No one comes in, no one goes out. You try anything, and the next person needing a healer in this town will be you." The threat was blunt, brutal, and utterly real. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the veil of her grief-numbed existence. She looked past Thorne to the deputies. Miller, a young man who still had some light in his eyes, wouldn't meet her gaze. Cobb just spat tobacco juice into the dust. There was no help there. She was forced. They brought him in his dead weight a strain, even for 2 men, and laid him on her husband's bed. The bed she hadn't been able to bring herself to sleep in for 2 years. The smell of him, blood-sweat leather, and the wild, earthy scent of the plains filled her home. They cut his bonds, and his hands fell limp at his sides. "He wakes up, you scream," Thorn ordered. "He tries anything, you scream. If we have to come in here, he won't be the only one bleeding. You understand?" Clara could only nod her throat tight. They left, closing the door behind them and plunging the cabin into a tense gloom. She was alone with him. For a long moment she stood, frozen, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He was the enemy, the savage from the stories children were told to make them behave. His people were the reason the territory was a place of fear, the reason men carried rifles to plough their fields. But as she looked at him, the stories faded. She saw not a demon, but a man grievously wounded. The healer in her, the part of her that understood the language of pain, began to stir. It was a compulsion stronger than her fear, stronger than Thorn's threats. With trembling hands, she lit another lantern. The golden light washed over him, revealing the sharp, high planes of his cheekbones, a strong jawline, and a mouth that, even slack in unconsciousness, was set in a firm line. He was younger than she'd thought. Perhaps her own age, not yet 30. She took a breath and went to work. His buckskin shirt was stiff with dried blood. Cutting it away revealed the source, a deep gash on his shoulder, angry and inflamed. It was a knife wound, not a bullet. The wound on his thigh was worse. A bullet had torn through the muscle, and the crude bandage had done little to stop the bleeding. He was burning with fever. She fetched her supplies, boiled water, clean linen strips, a salve of yarrow and comfrey. Her hands, which had been trembling, grew steady as she focused on the task. This was her domain. Cleaning the wounds, she worked with a detached professionalism, her touch gentle but firm. As she irrigated the gash on his shoulder, he groaned, a low, guttural sound from deep in his chest. His eyes flickered open. They were not the wild, hate-filled eyes she expected. They were the color of dark, wet earth, clouded with pain, but lucid. They locked onto hers. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. There was no cabin, no sheriff, no war party. There was only the connection between 2 people, one in agony, the other trying to ease it. In his eyes, she saw not a savage, but a fierce intelligence, a flicker of defiance that even this pain could not extinguish. He was assessing her, reading her intent. He didn't fight her. He didn't try to move. He simply watched, his jaw tight against the waves of pain her probing fingers caused. She worked in silence, her movements economical and sure. She packed the wounds with her poultice, the sharp, clean scent of yarrow mingling with the scent of his blood. She bound them tightly with fresh linen. She forced a willow bark tea between his lips to fight the fever, lifting his head with a practiced ease. He drank his throat, working his eyes, never leaving hers. When she was done, she stood back, her body aching with a tension she hadn't realized she was holding. The initial adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a profound weariness and a new kind of fear. She had not just tended to a wound. She had crossed a line. By treating him with care, with a humanity Thorn had expressly forbidden, she had made a silent declaration. As she watched his breathing deepen his body, finally succumbing to an exhausted sleep, she felt the weight of her choice settle upon her. Sheriff Thorn wanted him alive enough to torture. She was trying to truly save him. These 2 goals could not coexist. Outside, the silhouette of Deputy Cobb passed by the window. She was a prisoner in her own home, guardian to a man who was her people's enemy, and a pawn in a game she didn't understand. She had been forced to take him in, but the act of healing him that had been her own. And she had a sinking feeling it would cost her everything. The days bled into one another, measured by the rising and falling of the Lakota's fever. Clara moved in a fog of exhaustion. Her life shrunk to the four walls of the cabin. Twice a day, Deputy Miller would leave a parcel of food and a bucket of fresh water on her doorstep knock once and retreat. He never spoke, and she never opened the door until he was gone. The constant silent presence of the guards outside was a fence around her world. Inside that fence, a strange silent language developed between patient and nurse. His name as Thorne had spat it was Kangi, but in her mind, he was simply the man. He rarely spoke his voice, a low rasp, when he did asking for water in clipped, broken English. But his eyes were a conversation in themselves. They followed her every move as she tended to him, a mixture of suspicion, pain, and a guarded curiosity. She learned his rhythms. She knew the way his jaw would clench just before a wave of pain hit the slight tremor in his hand that signaled the fever was rising again. He in turn learned hers. He saw the deep-set weariness in her eyes, the way she would sometimes pause and stare at the empty chair by the hearth, her husband's chair, her expression lost and hollow. On the third day, the fever broke. She was sponging his face with cool water when his eyes opened clear and sharp for the first time. The fog of delirium was gone. The bullet, he said, his voice surprisingly strong. "It is still in my leg." Clara froze. She had known, of course. She could feel the lump of lead deep in the muscle, but she lacked the skill and the tools to remove it. To try would be to risk crippling him or killing him. "I cannot take it out," she said softly. "To do so, it requires a doctor's knife. I am only a healer." He considered her words, his gaze intense. This sheriff, Thorne, he will bring a doctor. She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her. "No, he wants you alive, but he doesn't want you whole. He wants you weak." A flicker of something understanding, perhaps even grim respect, passed through his eyes. He knew his situation perfectly. He pushed himself up on his elbows, a wince of pain crossing his face. "My name is Kangi Hotan." The full name sounded like a pronouncement. It held a weight that Kangi alone did not. Crow's voice. "I am Clara May Thompson," she replied, offering her own name in return. It was a formal exchange, a recognition of each other as more than just a prisoner and a jailer. "Clara May," he repeated the syllables, sounding foreign and soft on his tongue. "You gave me water. You cleaned my wounds. Why, it is what I do," she said simply. "I heal. You heal your enemy." He pressed his gaze, unwavering. The question hung between them. Was he her enemy? The abstract concept of the fearsome Lakota warrior was hard to reconcile with the vulnerable man lying in her husband's bed, whose life was literally in her hands. "You were a wounded man brought to my door," she answered carefully. "The reasons you are here are between you and the sheriff. The fact that you are wounded is between you and me." He seemed to accept this, sinking back onto the pillow. But the dynamic had shifted. They were no longer silent strangers. They were Kangi Hotan and Clara May, two people trapped in a dangerous cage. The next afternoon there was a sharp rap on the door. It wasn't the soft knock of Deputy Miller. Clara's heart leapt into her throat. Kangi's eyes snapped open, his hand instinctively moving to his wounded side. "Mrs. Thompson." It was Thorne's voice, impatient and hard. "Open up! I'm coming in!" Panic seized her. She threw a look at Kangi, whose face had become an impassive mask, but his eyes were burning with a cold fire. She moved to the door, her hands shaking as she lifted the latch. Thorne strode in, bringing the stench of whiskey and dust with him. His eyes immediately went to the bed, taking in Kangi's alert state, the clean bandages, the paleness of his skin that spoke of blood loss, but not of impending death. Well, well, Thorn sneered. Looks like our little medicine woman has done her job. He looks almost human. He walked to the bed and stared down at Kangi, who met his gaze without flinching. Ready to talk yet? Chief Kangi remained silent, his expression unreadable. Thorn chuckled a nasty, grating sound. Still proud. Don't worry, we'll break that. Just need you on your feet first. He turned his attention back to Clara. How's his leg? The bullet is still in it, she said, her voice tight. It needs to come out, or the wound will fester. Let it fester, Thorn said with a shrug. A man with a limp is easier to keep in chains. Just keep him breathing. He looked around the small cabin, his gaze lingering on the neatly stacked firewood, the clean swept floor. His eyes held a proprietary air that made Clara's skin crawl. You're doing a good job, Clara. Maybe after this is all over, you'll have earned a permanent place in this town. A man like Deputy Miller, he's looking for a wife, a quiet, obedient woman. The veiled threat was as clear as a gunshot. Her future, her very survival was tied to her compliance. She felt a surge of defiant anger, but swallowed it down, giving him only a slight, non-committal nod. Satisfied, Thorn turned to leave. At the door, he paused. Don't get any ideas, you two. Don't think, because he can open his eyes, you're friends. He'd scalp you as soon as look at you, Clara. And he... Thorn jerked his head toward Kangi, should remember that her life is in your hands. You make a move, she pays the price. The door slammed shut, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The air was poisoned with his presence. Clara leaned against the door, her knees weak. She was trapped not only by the guards outside, but by the sheriff's cruel manipulation. He had made her Kangi's shield and his hostage. He lies, Kangi's voice cut through the silence. She turned to look at him. His face was no longer a mask. It was etched with a cold fury. The Blackwood stage, he said, his English slow and deliberate. My war party did not attack it. Clara stared at him. But the sheriff, the whole town saw the bodies. There was a fight. Kangi confirmed, his eyes distant. We found the stage already attacked, the guards dead. It was attacked by Cheyenne dog soldiers, old enemies. We fought them, drove them off. We were taking the strongbox to trade for its return as a sign of peace with the fort. A new treaty. He paused, his gaze returning to hers, sharp and piercing. Then Thorn and his men came. They saw us with the box and the bodies. They opened fire without a word. It was a trap. Clara's mind reeled. It was a story so different from the one she'd been told, yet it held the ring of truth. Thorn wasn't a lawman seeking justice. He was a vulture who had stumbled upon a scene of carnage and twisted it to his advantage. Or worse. Why, she whispered. Why would he do this? Kangi watched her, his expression grim. There is talk of gold in the hills north of here. Land that belongs to my people by treaty. A treaty is only paper. But a war breaks treaties. A war means the army comes. The army drives us out, and the land is free for men like him to take. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Thorn didn't just want to find a war party. He wanted to create one. He needed Kangi to confess to the attack, to give him the excuse he needed, to start a fire that would burn across the territory, a fire from which he could pick through the ashes for gold. She looked at Kangi, truly looked at him, and saw not just a man, but the linchpin in a violent, greedy scheme. And she, Clara May Thompson, the quiet widow, was the one tasked with keeping that linchpin alive for the hangman. That night, She couldn't sleep. She sat in the rocking chair, watching the slow rise and fall of Kangi's chest in the moonlight. The whispers in the cabin were no longer just the sounds of healing and pain. They were whispers of conspiracy of lies, and of a danger far greater than a wounded warrior. She was no longer just his healer. She was his only witness, and if Thorn's plan succeeded, witnesses were not something he could afford to leave alive. The revelation of Thorn's treachery settled like a stone in Clara's stomach. It recontextualized every threat, every sneer, every watchful glance from the deputies outside. She wasn't just harboring a prisoner. She was caught in the gears of a machine designed to grind the Lakota people into dust for profit. And her own life was entangled in its workings. A silent pact formed between them in the days that followed. It wasn't spoken, but it was there, in the way Kangi would now share what little he knew of Thorn's men, their habits, their numbers. It was there in the way Clara would describe the layout of the town, the distance to the livery, the times when the deputies seemed most lax. They were no longer patient and nurse. They were conspirators. Kangi's strength returned with frustrating slowness. The bullet in his thigh was a constant throbbing source of pain and weakness. He began to do small exercises in the bed, clenching his muscles, fighting the atrophy. The effort would leave him slick with sweat, his face pale, but he never complained. Clara would watch her heart, a tight knot of admiration and fear. She was nursing him back to a strength he would need to escape an act that was a direct betrayal of the sheriff who held her life in his hands. The younger one, Kangi said one evening, his voice low. They spoke only after the sun had set, when the shadows in the cabin grew long, and the world outside seemed to fall away. The deputy. Miller. He does not have the eyes of a killer like the other one. His young Clara agreed, mending one of her husband's old shirts, her hands needing the familiar steady work. He was a farm boy from back east. I think he's afraid of Thorn. Fear can be a tool, Kangi mused, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, or a weakness. He began to teach her things, not with grand lessons, but in small practical ways. He showed her how to read the subtle changes in the wind's direction by the way the smoke from her chimney drifted. He taught her the Lakota word for water, emenita, and for bread, aguyape. He told her that the yarrow she used to pack his wounds was called taiopi fajuta, by his people, the medicine for wounds. In return, she shared her world with him. She told him about her husband John, about his kindness, and the way he had believed in building a life here, not just tearing riches from the land. She spoke of her life back in Ohio, a place of green hills and gentle rains that felt like a different planet from this harsh, sun-baked territory. As they spoke, the walls of prejudice and fear that had separated them crumbled away, revealing the common ground of two people who had known loss and who were now facing a desperate future. She began to see the world through his eyes, a world not of empty wilderness to be tamed, but of a sacred land, every rock and river with a name and a story. He in turn began to see her not as a generic white woman, a settler, but as Clara May, a woman of quiet strength, with hands that could heal, and a spirit that refused to be completely broken by grief or fear. The turning point came a week after Thorn's visit. Deputy Miller brought the daily supplies, but this time he lingered at the door. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and strained. He refused to look at her, his eyes fixed on the worn wood of her porch. "Yes, Deputy Sheriff's getting impatient. He's been drinking heavy. He was talking about bringing the prisoner to the jailhouse soon, for proper questioning." The euphemism was chilling. Proper questioning meant ropes and hot irons. It meant a pain that Clara's salves could not heal. "Thank you for the warning, Mr. Miller," she said softly. He finally looked at her, his young face a mask of conflict. John Thompson was a good man. He didn't hold with the way the sheriff does things. "Be careful, ma'am." He turned and walked away before she could reply. That night the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken urgency. Clara relayed Miller's warning to Kangi. He listened, his expression hardening into stone. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, hissing in pain as his weight settled on his injured thigh. He stood using the bedpost for support, his body trembling with the effort. "I cannot fight him like this," Kangi said, his voice tight with frustration. "But I cannot go to that jail." "We need to get the bullet out," Clara stated. It was no longer a question. It was a necessity. "It's poisoning you, keeping you weak." "You said you could not," he reminded her. "I said I'm not a doctor," she corrected. "But I've seen it done. My father was a butcher before he was a farmer. I know how to use a knife. It will be painful and dangerous. If I cut in the wrong place, the alternative is thorn," he finished for her. "There is no choice. The decision was made. They would do it tomorrow night, when the moon was new and the darkness was deepest." An escape was no longer a vague hope. It was a concrete plan, and this was the first terrible step. Clara spent the next day preparing. She boiled her sharpest skinning knife, her tweezers and strips of clean linen until they were sterile. She prepared a strong tincture of opium, a precious commodity she kept for the worst pain, and a poultice of chewed willow bark for the fever that would surely follow. Her stomach was a cold, hard knot of fear. She was about to deliberately carve into a man's flesh, her only guide, a half-remembered observation from her childhood. As dusk fell, Kangi drank the bitter opium tincture without complaint. She gave him a strip of thick leather to bite down on. "You are a strong woman, Clara May," he said, his voice already a little slurred, his eyes dark and trusting as he looked up at her. "Stronger than you know." She took a deep breath, the lantern light glinting on the blade of the knife in her hand. "Pray that I am strong enough." She made the incision. Kangi's body arched in a silent scream, his knuckles white where he gripped the bed frame. The smell of fresh blood filled the cabin. Working by the unsteady light, her own heart hammering against her ribs, she probed the wound. Sweat beaded on her forehead, stinging her eyes. Time seemed to stretch and distort. There was only the feel of the steel against his flesh, the desperate search for the foreign object lodged within. Then she felt it. The dull scrape of metal on metal. "I have it," she whispered more to herself than to him. With painstaking care, she worked the tweezers into the wound, grasped the misshapen lump of lead and pulled. It came free with a sickening sound. Kangi let out a strangled cry, his body going limp against the mattress as the raw agony washed over him. Clara dropped the bloody bullet into a bowl with a clatter. She worked quickly now, her hands moving with a desperate certainty. She cleaned the wound, packed it with the willow poultice, and bound it tightly, her movements sure and practiced despite the trembling in her arms. When it was done, she collapsed into the rocking chair, the bloody knife still clutched in her hand. Kangi was unconscious, his breathing shallow. The room swam around her. She had done it. She had committed herself utterly to his cause. There was no going back. She wasn't just his healer anymore. She was his surgeon, his co-conspirator, his only hope. And as she watched him sleep, a fierce, terrifying thought took root in her mind. It was no longer just about survival. It was about justice. Thorne had made a pawn of her, but she would not let him win his bloody game. She would see this man free or die trying. The 2 days following the crude surgery were a blur of whispered plans and agonizing recovery. The opium was gone, and Kangi bore the pain in stoic silence, his jaw perpetually tight. But the angry redness around the wound on his thigh began to fade, and the deep, enduring fever was gone. A fire had returned to his eyes, the fire of a man preparing for battle. They knew Thorn would not wait much longer. Miller's warning had bought them time, but the clock was ticking. Their plan was simple, desperate, and hinged on a dozen things going right. The guards, Miller and Cobb, were creatures of habit. They changed shifts at midnight, a process that involved Cobb, the night guard, walking to the edge of town to wake Miller. For 5 minutes, perhaps 10, the cabin would be unwatched. It was their only window. The creek Kangi had rasped, pointing a finger toward the back of the cabin. It runs deep behind your home. The sound of the water will hide our noise. They would need a diversion. Something to draw attention away from the cabin at the crucial moment. The livery Clara said, her mind racing. Old Man Hemlock's livery. It's full of dry hay. A lantern, accidentally, knocked over. It was a terrible risk. Fire was the great fear of every frontier town. But it was the only distraction, loud and bright enough to pull every eye in Redemption Gulch. On the third night after the surgery, a storm was brewing. The air was heavy and thick, and distant thunder rumbled in the west. It was a gift from whatever gods watched over desperate people. As the town settled into an uneasy pre-storm slumber, Clara made her final preparations. She packed a small satchel with what was left of her healing supplies, a loaf of bread, and a small skin of water. She put on her sturdiest boots and her late husband's durable canvas coat. It hung loose on her frame, but it was warm and practical. Kangi was already dressed. He had sliced strips from his blanket and wrapped them around his feet to muffle his steps. He moved with a pronounced limp, but his movements were deliberate and steady. He had carved a crude handle for the skinning knife she had used on him, turning it into a formidable weapon. The tension in the cabin was a living thing. They sat in the dark, listening. The rumble of thunder grew closer. They heard the crunch of Cobb's boots in the dirt as he began his walk to wake Miller. It was time. "Are you ready?" Kangi's voice was a low whisper beside her. "No," she answered honestly. "But I am going." He gave a slight nod, a flash of a smile in the darkness. "That is the same thing." Clara slipped out the front door, her heart in her throat. The night was pitch black beneath the churning clouds. She crept along the side of her cabin, keeping to the deepest shadows. The town was a collection of dark shapes against a darker sky. The only light came from the saloon, a dull yellow glow spilling from its windows. She moved like a ghost, her path memorized from years of living on this periphery. The livery smelled of hay manure and leather. The side door was never locked. She slipped inside the darkness, absolute. She fumbled for the lantern she knew Hemlock kept hanging on a peg, her fingers closing around the cold metal. She struck a match, the sudden flare blinding her. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the lantern. Setting a fire, even a small one, felt like a monumental crime. But then she pictured Thorn's face and Kangi's face contorted in pain, and her resolve hardened. She placed the lantern on a pile of loose hay in the corner, far from the stalls where the horses were kept. Then, taking a deep breath, she tipped it over. The flame caught instantly, devouring the dry straw with a hungry roar. She didn't wait to watch it grow. She fled, retracing her steps, her lungs burning. By the time she reached her cabin, a faint orange glow was already visible over the rooftops, and the first distant shout of fire cut through the night. Kangi was waiting at the back window. He had already pried the wooden shutter loose. He helped her through, his grip on her arm strong and sure. They didn't look back. They plunged into the darkness behind the cabin towards the sound of the rushing creek. The fire was their cover. Shouts and panicked neighs echoed from the town. Every able-bodied man, including they, prayed Miller and Cobb would be running towards the flames. The bank of the creek was steep and slick with mud. Kangi went first, half sliding, half climbing down to the water's edge. He turned and reached for her. Clara scrambled down after him, her boots sinking into the soft earth. The water was shockingly cold, stealing her breath as it swirled around her knees. They moved down the creek using the water to cover their tracks. The current was strong, pulling at their legs. Kangi moved with a grim determination, one hand braced against the muddy bank to support his injured leg. The glow from the fire in town painted the storm clouds a hellish orange. It felt like they were escaping from the end of the world. After a quarter of a mile, Kangi found what he was looking for, a place where a thicket of willows grew down to the water's edge. He pushed his way through, holding the branches back for her. They collapsed on the other side, hidden from view, their bodies trembling with cold and adrenaline. They were soaked, shivering, and exhausted. But they were free. From their hiding place, they could see the lights of torches moving frantically around the town. The fire at the livery was a raging beacon in the night. They had done it. The first drops of rain began to fall fat and cold, turning the dust to mud. The storm had broken. It would wash away their scent, their tracks, any sign they had ever been there. Kangi looked at her, his face barely visible in the gloom. He reached out and brushed a wet strand of hair from her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You have the heart of a warrior, Clara May," he said, his voice filled with a raw respect that warmed her more than any fire could. In that moment, she was no longer Clara May Thompson, the forgotten widow of Redemption Gulch. She was a fugitive, an arsonist, an ally to a man the world called a savage. She looked back towards the chaotic glow of the town she had left behind, then ahead into the vast, stormy darkness of the plains. She had never been more terrified or more alive. The wilderness was a harsh and unforgiving sanctuary. The storm that had covered their escape turned the plains into a sea of mud, but it also filled the gullies with life-giving water. For days they moved under the cover of darkness, resting in hidden ravines or thickets of cottonwood during the day. Kangi, who had seemed like a captive lion in her cabin, was transformed. Here in his own element, he was the master. He moved with a quiet confidence, his limp a constant companion, but not a hindrance. He taught Clara how to find north, using the stars, how to identify edible roots, and how to walk so silently that the prairie dogs barely noticed their passing. She in turn used her knowledge to tend to his still-healing leg, finding herbs by the creek beds to make fresh poultices. They were a team bound by shared danger and a growing unspoken affection. The harshness of their journey stripped away all pretense. They saw each other at their most vulnerable, huddled together for warmth against the biting night wind, sharing the last of their bread, their faces smudged with dirt and etched with exhaustion. It was in these quiet moments that the bond between them deepened into something more profound than alliance. It was the way he would hand her the first drink from a freshly found spring, or the way she would instinctively reach out to steady him when his leg faltered. Love, she realized, didn't always arrive with poetic words and grand gestures. Sometimes it grew like a hardy plains flower, in the toughest of soil, nurtured by simple acts of care and mutual respect. After a week of travel, Kangi found the signs he was looking for: a broken arrow shaft, left in a specific way, a pattern of stones on a hillside. He was leading them to his people, not to a large encampment, but to the scattered bands that had been broken apart by the army and the treachery of men like Thorn. They found the first group in a hidden canyon. They were a shadow of a proud tribe, a few families, old men, women, and children, their faces thin with hunger and worry. Their leader was an old, weary man named Chaitan. Suspicion turned to astonishment when they saw Kangi Hotan, whom they had believed to be dead or captured. Kangi did not speak of his own ordeal at first. He spoke of the trap at the Blackwood stage of Thorn's plan to seize their lands. He told them of the woman Clara May, who had saved his life at the risk of her own. Clara stood beside him, feeling the weight of a dozen pairs of dark, assessing eyes. She was the enemy, a white woman, but she was also presented as their savior. It was Kangi's plan that turned the tide. Thorn expected the Lakota to retaliate with raids to behave like the savages he portrayed them as. That would bring the army, which was his ultimate goal. "We will not fight his war," Kangi declared, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. "We will unmask his." His legend began not with a battle, but with an act of cunning. He learned from scouts that a government shipment of annuity goods, blankets, flour, and salt, was due at the agency near the edge of the territory. It was guarded, but not heavily. More importantly, a rival Lakota band, led by a hot-headed warrior named Wombly, was planning to raid it out of desperation. Wombly's band did not trust Kangi and believed that fighting was the only answer. Thorn knew about this planned raid. In fact, he had encouraged it through whispers and false promises delivered by a half-breed traitor named Antoine Leroux. A raid on government property would be the final nail in the coffin of the peace treaty. The army would have no choice but to declare all-out war. Kangi acted swiftly. With a handful of warriors from Chaitan's camp, he didn't attack the shipment. He intercepted Wombly's war party first. There was a tense standoff, warriors from the two bands facing each other with weapons drawn. Instead of fighting, Kangi spoke. He laid out Thorn's entire plan, revealing how Wombly was being played as a pawn. He exposed Leroux as Thorn's man. Wombly, proud and arrogant, refused to believe him. "You speak with the tongue of the white woman who follows you," Wombly sneered. It was then that Clara stepped forward. Her heart hammered, but her voice was clear. She spoke not of treaties or gold, but of what she had seen. She described Thorn, his greed, the way he spoke of the Lakota as keys and tools. She spoke in simple, honest English, and one of Chaitan's warriors who knew the language translated. Her words, coming from an enemy, carried a strange and powerful weight. Still, Wombly was not convinced. The proof came an hour later. Kangi had sent 2 of his best scouts ahead. They returned, dragging Antoine Leroux, captured, as he was riding to meet with Thorn's men, who were lying in wait to heroically save the shipment after the raid, creating perfect witnesses to Lakota aggression. Faced with exposure, Leroux confessed everything. Kangi's actions that day were a masterstroke. He had not only prevented the raid that would have started a war, but he had also exposed the traitor, and most importantly, saved Wombly and his warriors from riding into a massacre. He had shown Wombly that wisdom was stronger than rage. Humbled and grateful, Wombly pledged his loyalty to Kangi. With the 2 bands, united word spread like wildfire across the plains. Kangi Hotan was not dead. He had returned not just as a warrior, but as a leader with a vision. He was the Crow's voice who spoke of a different way, a way to fight their enemies, not with arrows alone, but with their own cunning. Clara watched this transformation with a sense of awe. The quiet, wounded man from her cabin was becoming a figure of immense power, his name whispered with reverence. He moved with a new confidence, the limp still there, but now a part of his story, a symbol of his survival. One evening, as they sat by a fire in the heart of the growing encampment, he turned to her. The firelight played across the strong lines of his face. "In my world," he said, his voice soft, "a person's name is their path. I am Kangi Hotan, the crow's voice. But you have no name among us." He took her hand. His was calloused and strong, hers smaller, but no less capable. "They call you the White Healer," he continued. "But that is only what you do. It is not who you are. I call you Wiyawa, Changte, my heart. For you saved the heart in my chest, and you have captured it." He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperate passion, but of deep, profound connection, a sealing of the bond forged in pain, fear, and mutual salvation. In that moment, surrounded by the vast, starry expanse of the Dakota sky, she knew she was no longer just running with him. She was home. But their story was not over. A legend forged had to be tested, and the man who had inadvertently created it, Sheriff Elias Thorne, was still in Redemption Gulch, growing more powerful and certain that his enemies were dead and buried. The autumn winds swept across the high plains, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of snow. Kangi's encampment had grown. Word of his survival and cunning had drawn families from their hiding places, warriors disillusioned with pointless raids, and leaders who saw in him a new hope. He was no longer a fugitive, but the center of a unified force, a nascent Lakota nation reborn in the wilderness. But their new strength was fragile. They lived on what they could hunt, and the coming winter would be long and hard. More than that, the lie of the Blackwood Stage massacre still stood. In the eyes of the white world, in the ledgers of the army at Fort Laramie, Kangi Hotan and his people were murderers. It was a poison that would eventually destroy them. "We cannot live as ghosts forever," Kangi said during a council of elders and warriors. "Thorne's lie must be cut out like the bullet in my leg." The council was divided. Many like Wombly urged for a direct assault on Redemption Gulch to burn the town as Clara had burned the livery. "An eye for an eye will leave us all blind," Kangi argued, his voice calm but firm. "We will return to the town, but not as a war party. We will return as the truth." His plan was audacious. He would not attack Redemption Gulch, but surround it. He would not demand blood, but justice. He would force a confrontation, not on a bloody battlefield, but in the court of public opinion. He would expose Thorne to his own people. Clara was now a fixture at his side. She was no longer an outsider. She had learned the basics of the Lakota language, and the women of the tribe had taught her how to bead and tan hides, respecting the skill in her hands. She was Wiyawa, chung to his heart, and her counsel was valued in his inner circle. She knew the minds of the townspeople better than anyone. "They are afraid," she told him as they planned their return. "Thorne rules them through fear and lies. If you give them a different story, a believable one, some will listen. Men like Deputy Miller, maybe even Dr. Abernathy if he can find his courage. Their key was the traitor Antoine Leroux. He was their proof." The day they returned was cold and grey. 100 warriors painted not for war, but for grim ceremony rode with Kangi. They did not charge in with war cries. They emerged from the hills like spirits, taking up silent, watchful positions on the ridges overlooking the town. They blocked the main road in and out. It was a siege of presence, not of violence. The town panicked. Men grabbed their rifles, women and children scurried indoors. Doors were barred, windows shuttered. Redemption Gulch became a town holding its breath. Sheriff Thorne, flanked by Cobb and a nervous-looking Miller, rode to the edge of town, his face a mask of blustering fury. He had believed Kangi to be dead, a problem solved. Seeing him alive at the head of a formidable force sent a shock through him, that was visible even from a distance. Kangi, with Clara riding beside him and Wombly on his other side, rode forward to meet him. He stopped 100 yards from the sheriff, a symbolic gulf between them. He had a length of rope in his hand, LaRue tied to the end of it. Sheriff Thorne Kangi's voice, the voice of the crow, carried on the wind, clear and powerful. It was a voice accustomed to commanding men and speaking across vast open spaces. "You have been telling stories about me." Thorne's hand went to his gun. "I see the coyotes have let their pet savage off his leash. You're a wanted man, Kangi. You and your whole band of murderers. Surrender now and I'll see you get a quick hanging." "I am not here to surrender," Kangi called back. "I am here for a trial for the murder of the men on the Blackwood stage. We will have it now in front of your people and mine." He shoved LaRue forward, forcing him to his knees in the dust. "And I have brought a witness." The sight of the known traitor, bound and terrified, sent a ripple of confusion through the armed townsmen who had gathered behind Thorne. This wasn't the simple scenario of savages at the gate they had been led to expect. "He is a liar!" Thorne bellowed, his composure starting to crack. "He'll say whatever you want to save his own skin." "Then let the people decide who is telling the truth," Kangi challenged. "Let LaRue speak, and then you will speak, and then I will speak. We will let the truth have its day in the sun." This was his trap. It wasn't one of arrows and knives, but of words and honor. He was banking on the fact that even in a town as rotten as Redemption Gulch, the truth still held power. He was challenging Thorne's authority in front of the very people he ruled. Clara watched Thorne's face. She saw the flicker of panic in his eyes, the cornered rat desperation. He couldn't allow this to happen. He couldn't let LaRue speak. "This is my town," Thorne roared, finally losing control. He drew his pistol. "I am the law here, and the law says you hang." He didn't aim at Kangi. He aimed at Clara. It was a calculated, cruel move. She was the linchpin, the white woman who gave Kangi's story credibility. To kill her would be to silence the most dangerous witness and prove that Kangi could not protect his own. The world seemed to slow down. Clara saw the flash of the barrel, the tightening of Thorne's finger on the trigger. But before Thorne could fire, another shot rang out closer from beside him. Thorne staggered, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. He looked down at the blossoming red stain on his own chest, then looked at the man next to him. Deputy Miller stood there, his own pistol smoking his young face, pale and set. He had made his choice. Thorne collapsed into the dust, and the tense silence of the standoff shattered. The siege was over. The battle for Redemption Gulch was about to begin. The death of Sheriff Thorne was the spark. Before Thorne's body hit the dust shot by his own conflicted Deputy Miller, the gunfight exploded. Cobb and Thorne's loyalists opened fire, and the air filled with lead. Kangi's warriors responded not with blind rage, but with disciplined precision, their targets the men who had propped up Thorne's corrupt rule. Amidst the chaos, Clara refused to hide. She became a whirlwind of healing, tearing strips from her own clothes to bind the wounds of Lakota and townsmen alike, her courage a beacon in the smoke. The battle was short. Miller, seeing the futility, shouted for a ceasefire, and the townsfolk, their will broken, threw down their arms. In the ringing silence, justice was swift. Kangi dragged the traitor LaRue before the assembled town and the later arriving army patrol. LaRue's confession exposed the entire conspiracy, a truth Miller confirmed. Kangi Houghton's name was cleared, and the foundation of a true peace was laid upon the ashes of Thorne's greed. On the day his people prepared to leave, Kangi paused. He dismounted and walked to Clara, taking her hands before the eyes of all. "You were forced to take a wounded man," he declared, his voice carrying across the silent street. But you healed a nation. He turned to his people, calling her Wiawa Changte, my heart. Then back to the town. I am their leader, he proclaimed, his voice ringing with love and authority. But she is their queen. He lifted her onto his horse, and together they rode toward the open plains, no longer a fugitive and his healer, but the legendary king and queen of the high plains. And so the story of Clara May and Kangi Houghton was etched into the history of the high plains, a tale born not from fantasy, but from the grit, desperation, and unexpected love that defined the true Wild West. It reminds us that legends aren't born, they are forged in the fires of adversity, and that the greatest strength can be found in the courage to heal rather than to hate. Theirs is a legacy of two worlds colliding to create a new one, a testament to the fact that even in the dustiest corners of history, love and justice can find a way to bloom. If their story of survival courage and unlikely love moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this piece of hidden history with others who appreciate tales of the real Wild West. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more stories that bring the past to life. Thank you for listening.